A pleasant day to every single one of you. Welcome to one of our last discussions in Earth Science. Actually, this would be the very last topic that I will be discussing, since the other topics which are actually related with the remainder of Earth Science will simply be discussed by the student teachers that we have for our class as a part of their final demonstration. So this will be the very last topic that I will be discussing on Earth Science, and it is actually all about the concepts of the exogenic processes. So last time, it was actually discussed to you by your student teachers the concepts of volcanism, the different ideas which are actually included in the endogenic processes. So whenever we are talking about the ideas of the endogenic processes, these are now the different types of the movements or different types of movements which are happening and simply caused by the movements of the Earth's crust or the Earth's lithosphere. Okay, it is actually because of the movement of everything and anything that is present beneath our feet. So that's the thing about endogenic processes. That involves seismology and at the same time volcanology, or simply the seismic activities and the ideas of volcanism. So in the case of the exogenic processes, these are actually related with the different ideas and concepts which includes petrology and pedology. So whenever we are talking about pedology, remember that this is the study of soil, but in the case of the petrology, it is now the study of rocks. So, whenever we are talking about the exogenic processes, there are four major types of exogenic processes. Unlike in the case of the endogenic processes, which only includes seismic activities and volcanic activities, in the case of the exogenic processes, there are four. So we have the presence of weathering, the presence of mass movement, erosion, and even deposition. And let's simply start with weathering. So whenever we are talking about the presence of weathering, it is known as a process of physical disintegration and chemical decomposition of solid rocks materials at or near at the Earth's surface. So whenever we are talking about the presence of the ideas of weathering, it is actually the process in which the different rocks and the different minerals that are present on the surface of the Earth are actually eroding or they are being broken down to smaller pieces. Okay, so whenever we are talking about the ideas that are related with weathering, this is now how the different rocks and different types of minerals are being broken down from those huge chunks to smaller chunks. Okay, to the smaller pieces, just like the presence of sand, the presence of soil. That's actually because of the ideas or concepts of weathering. So remember, once again, when it comes to weathering, it is now breaking down different types of different materials, just like minerals and rocks, to create smaller materials and finer materials. So in the case of weathering, there are actually different types of it. So the first example or first type of weathering, it is known as the mechanical weathering. So from the name itself, mechanical weathering is being accomplished by different types of mechanical forces. So for instance, there is now the presence of the addition of ice and the presence of water. So mechanical weathering is being accomplished by different types of substrates or different types of materials. So mechanical weathering could be caused by freezing if it is present on a place where the temperature is very low. If the temperature on those locations are very low, it can actually create here that certain type of freezing process that the water will simply seep into the different cracks of these rocks. Then, because of very low temperature, the water will simply solidify. Then once it solidify, it will actually expand. With the expansion of the water or with the expansion of the ice that is present in this particular cracks on the rocks, it will now create here more cracks and it will now disintegrate this certain type of material. So in the case of mechanical weathering, it is being accomplished by different types of factors. It could include the water, it can include ice, it could also include air, okay, or wind specifically. So these are actually the different examples of mechanical weathering. Remember, mechanical weathering, there are different forces which are actually being included in these different types of materials. There's also the idea known as unloading. So in the case of unloading, it is now the point where the gravity is actually pulling these different materials downward. So we can actually observe here that these layers of rocks that are present here, it is actually permitting the sliding motion of this particular rocks, and once they crack, they will now expose the next layer of rocks, which will also be exposed to other types of mechanical um, processes, just like the presence of strong winds, the presence of rain, which will now erode this particular area. Once again, whenever we are talking about weathering, it is now the point where different rocks, it could be large boulders, it could be pebbles, then because of the presence of different types of mechanical processes, they will now be simply broken down. So, other than the presence of mechanical weathering, there's also the presence of biological weathering. So, biological weathering now involves the presence of different organisms. The most common type of organisms which can aid in weathering, they are known as the plants. The plants are using these different types of rocks to be their substrate. And once the roots of this rock, or once the roots of these plants penetrated the rocks, it can now actually disintegrate these materials. So the different roots that are present in these biological components in these plants can actually break down these rocks. So other than the presence of these plants, even animals can actually do biological weathering. So, for instance, if there are different organisms, just like the presence of a rodent and the presence of a tarantula, they can actually dig on different holes. And when it comes to the digging process, it is now scraping off the different layers of the rocks, and it can cause weathering. Okay? So, once again, in the case of the biological agents or biological weathering, they are now being created because of the presence of different organisms. Actually, even humans could induce biological weathering whenever we are walking on specific paths. If you have been to the National Museum, you can actually observe there that some of the stairs are quite eroded or it's somewhat weathered because of the steps of the people which are visiting in these locations. Okay. So those are actually some of the examples of biological weathering. So in the case of the chemical weathering, it now actually includes different types of processes. Just like what you can observe here, there's the process known as hydrolysis and at the same time oxidation. Because of the presence of water and the different elements and chemicals that are present in this particular drop of rain, whenever it is simply happening, it is now actually the process of chemical weathering. Chemical weathering can actually happen in basically different ways. Just like what I mentioned earlier, there's the presence of hydrolysis and oxidation, and even the presence of carbonation. So the reason why you can observe that the rocks are possessing different colors, just like the color of rust, it is actually because of the addition of water and the presence of oxygen. Since there is iron in these different layers of rocks, they are now starting to rust, to create rust. So that is the reason why you can see or you can observe here different coloration. It is because of hydrolysis and oxidation. While you can also observe that in some rocks, there is now the presence of carbonation, or it's now the presence of the carbonic acid, which will simply sip inside this rock, and it will start to disintegrate the different materials or minerals that are present in this particular location. Then there's also the presence of solution weathering, that because of the acidity that is present on the rain, for instance, the presence of acid rain, it can actually melt different types of materials, specifically the ones which are possessing limestone and even some statues. The reason why these statues are possessing different types of weathering is actually because of acid rain. So, because of the presence of the acidity in the rain, it can actually affect and create chemical weathering to these different types of structures. either man-made or it could also be natural. Okay, so whenever we are talking about the presence of weathering, there are basically three types of weathering: the presence of mechanical, then biological, and even chemical weathering. So other things that we can actually observe in the process of weathering, um, once again, because of the presence of different types of weathered materials, spontaneous weathering could also happen, which will now actually be the reason for the creation of soil. So the reason why soil is created, it is actually because of the continuous weathering that is happening on rocks. So soil came from rocks, basically. Okay, so that is how soils were actually formed. So other than the presence of weathering, there's also another type of exogenic process known as mass wasting. So mass wasting, it is now the movement of large mass of rocks, either weathered or not. And there is the presence of landslide and soil erosion. So what is the difference between landslide and soil erosion? So whenever we are talking about soil erosion, it is now actually a process of the erosion or the eroding part of a specific portion of the land. Okay? While in the case of the landslide, it can also involve the presence of large boulders and even the presence of much larger materials. So landslide is a larger scale than soil erosion. Okay? Soil erosion could actually happen in a small area only. But in the case of a landslide, it can happen on a large area. Okay? So in the case of the landslide, it also happens in the terrain where the slope is available. Okay? Large movement of rocks and debris are actually happening down the slope. So there should be the pull of gravity that's happening. So that's the reason why it is known as mass wasting, because large amount of materials are being carried. Then in the case of erosion naman, it is now the presence of the movement of the upper layer of the soil specifically. It could be because of the presence of water, it could also be because of the presence of wind. So once the upper portion of the soil is eroded, the fertility of the soil is also being decreased, since the humus, specifically the most nutritive part of the soil, is locations, since yeah, it is just because of different factors. So those are actually examples of erosion. So just like what you can observe here, um, in the case of the presence of deforestation, runoff, and sediment transport, because of the presence of lesser amount of vegetation in a location, there will be lesser infiltration of water. And once the lesser infiltration of water happens, there will be no more absorption of water, but rather there would just be runoff. And with this runoff, even the particles of sand, the particles of soil will simply be carried from one place to the next. There will be erosion. Okay? So, because of the presence of erosion, sediments will simply be deposited in different locations. If this will simply end in bodies of water, it can also cause clogging of these waterways, which later on could result to flooding in different areas, different locations. So other than the presence of landslide and soil erosion, there's also a process known as deposition. So in the case of the deposition, it is now the laying down of sediments carried away by wind, water, or ice. So sediments can be transported as pebbles, sand, and mud, or as solids dissolved in water. So once again, we have here some examples of mass wasting. So if landslide will happen, it will just be the movement from a high slope to a lower portion of the slope. Then the erosion would simply follow this certain type of process. Then these are just some examples of deposition that different sediments will simply be deposited in different areas of a river, for instance. Okay, so that's actually one of the reasons why um, exogenic processes can actually happen in different areas, in different locations, depending upon the different factors that are available in this area. So, another thing that we should always also understand is how watersheds are being created. So, watersheds are being created because of the presence of the movement of water from a high area to a low area. Usually, whenever there is flooding in the lowlands, for instance, kung bakit nagkakaroon ng baha dito sa Hagunoy, it is actually because of the movement of water from a high area to a low area. And sometimes, waters are being deposited to the lower areas. So that's actually some of the concerns whenever we are talking about flooding. So flooding is not only being concerned with the presence of water, but also the presence of other sediments, just like the presence or the addition of um, these different types of soil, the presence of rocks. They could actually result to the presence of the clogging of these different waterways, which will result to flooding in the low-lying areas. Just like, for instance, in our case, in Hagunoy, Kalumpit, Paumbong, Malolos, those are actually the different locations where water and flooding could happen because of deposition. So, the last type of exogenic process, it is now known as sedimentation. So in the case of sedimentation, obviously it is now the settling of fine and small materials in the bottom of undisturbed body of water. So if we're going to consider it, weathering, it is now the breakdown of large rocks, mass wasting, the transport of a lot of those destroyed rocks, for instance, then the presence of deposition, which is now how different types of sediments, different types of materials will simply be deposited in one area. Well, in the case of sedimentation, it's now the movement of sediments or smaller or finer materials. So, sedimentation is usually happening on the coast and on the beaches. So, for instance, we have here the Kapurpurawan Rock Formation that is present in Ilocos. So, deposition is actually happening because of the presence of the coast and the beaches. So, what is the difference between the beach and a coast? So, remember, the coast is part of the continental shelf, while the beach, it is now the sandy part of the shore. So in this particular case, this is not the presence of the coast of the Kapurpurawan Rock Formation. So in this particular area, um, a lot of sand will simply be will obviously undergone the process of sedimentation because of the process of a lot of weathering because of the forces that happened for these different types of sedimentary rocks to break down. That is the reason why these different coastlines were simply created. The reason why sand is created is actually because of the presence of the waves crashing through the shore. And you're actually going to observe this that if the um, coast is usually being bombarded by large waves or malalakas yung alon, usually mas pino yung buhangin. Kapag naman may hina lang yung alon or intermittent siya or hindi pare-pareho, usually yung coast nito ay merong mga pebbles lang. So you can actually observe here the intensity of the movement of the waves, kung ano nga bang uri ng coastline or ng beach ang matatagpuan dito. Kung pinong buhangin, thousands of years ago, sobrang lakas ng alon na tumatama sa mga dalampasigan na ito. So that is the reason why weathering is creating finer materials, finer sand. Okay, so other than the presence of these beaches, this actually a part of the Karamuan. Yes, the Karamuan Islands, if my memory serves me right, when it comes to this particular presentation. So you can actually observe that in the coast, there is now the presence of the weathered rocks and even the presence of the beaches. So, there, this is actually some of the wonders of exogenic processes. So, remember, just a recap, whenever we are talking about exogenic processes, there is the presence of weathering, mass movements, erosion, and deposition. So, lastly, it is actually the presence of the different layers of the soil. So, Basically, whenever we're talking about soil, it is now the unconsolidated mineral or organic materials on the immediate surface of the earth that serve as natural medium for the growth of land plants. Soil is created because of the exogenic processes that happened on rocks. Okay? Soil came from rocks and minerals. So the different layers of the soil, if we're going to consider the horizon that is present here, it is now the presence of the bedrock, which is now the source of the soil. Then the next one, the presence of the weathered rock fragments. Then after this, the presence of the subsoil, then the topsoil, and the humus. So the humus, it is now the nutritive part of the layer of the soil. Okay? Humus contains a lot of minerals, nutritive parts, for instance, decaying or decomposing materials from the organisms that were thriving on the surface of the earth. So basically, whenever we're talking about humus, it is now the most nutritive part of the soil. Okay, then the next one, the topsoil, which also contains some of the roots for to hold these particular plants. Then when it comes to the subsoil, it is now the location where the roots are mostly attached with. Then whenever we are talking about soils, there are now three basic types. We have the presence of um, a clay, the presence of loam, and the presence of sorry, this is now the sandy type of soil, the presence of clay soil, and the presence of loam soil. So if we're going to consider the composition of every single one of them, we actually have here a chart based on the amount of water that is present, amount of water, amount of sand, amount of silt that is present in this particular types of soils. But basically, whenever we're talking about once again the presence of soil, it will actually depend on the amount of water that it contains. Will it be a clay? Will it be silt? Will it be sand? Um, Obviously, if there's a lot of sand that is present in this soil, it will be a sandy soil. If there will be a lot of silt, it can actually create here some type of loam soil. Then if there's a lot of water and a certain type of soil, it will be an example of a sandy soil. So basically, I will be providing additional discussions which are related with exogenic processes, but this is just a recap or a review to every single one of you on how soil is being created and what are the different types of exogenic processes present in nature. So basically, whenever we are talking about the different concepts on earth science, always remember that it is always involving the different movements of the different layers of it. And once again, when it comes to this particular case, whenever we are pertaining to the different processes that shape the earth, there is the presence of the endogenic processes, which involves volcanism and seismic activities. Then in the case of the exogenic processes, there is now the presence of weathering, mass wasting, erosion, and even the presence of deposition and sedimentation. So basically, this is now the end of this short discussion regarding the exogenic processes. And if you have questions or queries, once again, you can reach me through via email or as a comment when it comes to this particular part. So this will actually be how I'm going to cap off all my discussions in Earth Science. And once again, the last few sets of topics would simply be discussed by your practice teachers for their demonstration teaching. And I am hoping that every single one of you will actually enjoy those presentations that they prepared for every single one of you for the summation or for the end of this particular course. So hopefully things will be okay when it comes to your end, and I guess that's it muna for the meantime. So thank you for listening to this short and quick presentation. So wait na lang dun sa additional materials that I could include in this particular lesson.